Hey all, sorry for not posting for about a week or so, give or take. I've just been really busy with my school finals and AP exams and whatnot. I also, if you can tell by my voice, I got sick again. It's a real pain in the ass. And I also still have a lot more stuff going on in the next few weeks, but hopefully I'll be able to post regularly. Anyways, let's get to the stories. I graduated high school almost a year ago. I had no real urge to attend college or the military and basically got stuck at my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before them. I knew I had an opportunity to leave town, so I signed up on a website that you may have heard of called wwoof.com. Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south. I got there and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought off Craigslist for $500. Later on, I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hipsters that were also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, self-absorbed, condescending, right out of college, but vapid as shit hipsters. I basically kept to myself, but was occasionally forced into conversation about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I had been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I had heard stories about Michael a couple of days before I showed up. He had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was really going to get involved with the farming and throw himself into Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character. His sentences ended with punctuation such as, and or and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of a lot of the friends I had left back home. However, we became fast friends, as he was the only person there that didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when we spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and of course, drugs. Every then and now he brought up subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me he came to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I began to understand his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these weird rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure it a week more. A couple of days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidin used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidin was, so I explained to him about Waco, Dave Koresh, and the botched siege by the FBI and the ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged. The government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth. That's so fucked up. I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopathic cult leader interested in power and nothing else, but he wouldn't have it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject, and I had just explained to him, and he's now telling me that I'm wrong and that Koresh was a martyr. This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After half an hour of this absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation with a fucking loon, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to deep hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket praying I'd grab my knife before I left the cabin. I know that sounds pretty ridiculous, but you don't walk my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it and turned around so that he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for about 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained to him what had happened and that we really needed to get rid of this guy. It didn't take much convincing, as no one really cared for him and he wasn't that much help on the farm. I felt really bad for snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had come here to get sober. I found it really strange, as he never actually told me anything about this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by, and the whole encounter kind of faded from my consciousness. Last night, though, I got a text. "Hey bro, this is Michael. We can get my car out for $280. Want to go traveling?" I never responded, though. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked me up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a lot of loud banging coming from in a barn. I remember thinking it must have been an animal, but also thinking it must have been a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to my cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was still pretty unsettled from the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we shared an outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on my shoes and walking around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know that sounds gross, but I'm the only one that uses that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouched in a corner of my kitchen, facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could even make, something you'd only hear Shaggy make in Scooby-Doo. This noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with his Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is that he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained me and Michael's history and what happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police really was frowned upon, since I believed many of the old hippies thought they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either, though. I couldn't sleep knowing Michael might be out there in those woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me up. Anyways, Michael, let's please not meet again. I'm a biologist and am frequently by myself in remote locations. This occurred when I was 26 and I was somewhere in between green and season. I was studying wetlands in a remote area of the Appalachians in an area dominated by thick pine forests. I always got on the country assessor site and printed off a map with landowner information so I wouldn't trespass. That, in this place, will get you shot. In this particular site, there was a private driveway going through the U.S. Forest Service land that's public. That let me get to this area a little quicker. This driveway was absolutely public property. At no point did I trespass. I pull onto this road, clearly created by the USFS, and pull off to the side about 30 yards from his entry gate. My vehicle was clearly a state-marked government vehicle. The forest is old-growth pine, but on the outer edge of the forest it's thick with undergrowth, forming kind of a wall before you get onto the pines into a nice open understory. I walk about 200 yards in when nature calls, and I make like a bear in the woods and do my business. I'm a biologist, it's no biggie. Midway through, I hear yelling back in my truck. I think, great, now I have to deal with this. I'm wrapping up my business, getting ready to walk back to the truck, and I hear gunshots. I stopped walking and thought, yeah, I'm not walking back to that. I was at a loss of what exactly to do, and stood there for about a minute considering my options when I heard him breaking through the undergrowth of the edge of the forest. Shit, he's coming into the woods. And again, this is public property. I get a bad vibe. This is absolutely the type of area where people can just straight up disappear, and believe me, they do. It's very, very remote, and the communities are very closed off. This county has more than double the amount of game wardens of other counties for a very good reason. I take off in a crouching jog, using my sense of direction to make out the main road about 600 yards away. I hear more gunshots, except these have a crack to them. That means they're coming in my direction. There's no way he sees me, but maybe he's hearing me. Maybe he's firing above my head. Adrenaline kicks in 100% now, and I'm moving with a mix of terror and urgency to get to the main road. I eventually get to the main road and hide under a bridge. I call a colleague to give him the details of where I am, so they can at least find my body. And then I call 911. This was the first time in my life I'd ever had to call 911. The 911 operator didn't believe me, but eventually I get in touch with a deputy. He doesn't believe me either. They're probably just shooting at tin cans. Bullshit, it's Sunday night at around 7 o'clock. This guy's just too lazy to get off his ass. I move further away into a public hunting area and a game warden stops in. God bless him. He took me seriously. And a few locals come by and comment on how the landowner is a total asshole. He was from Louisiana and not a local. I got along well with all the locals I had encountered, so this made more sense. After an hour, the deputy gives me a ride back to my state vehicle. The son of a bitch is parked on an ATV with a rifle laid across his lap, waiting for me in the dark. The deputy and I get out of the car, and I just walk straight to my truck and leave. It's almost 9 o'clock, and I had a 4-hour drive to get home, and I had just had enough. At the time, I didn't want to talk to the guy at all, but now I wish I had. Who knows what conversation the deputy and him had. After this experience, I quietly started carrying a firearm in the field with me at all times. I'm glad I trusted my gut feeling and insisted on a police escort back to my vehicle. This was not an encounter or conversation I wanted to have with somebody with an overly active trigger finger. I had all the guy's contact information from the county assessor site, and I thought about mailing him a map clearly stating where his property begins and ends, but I just decided to be a bigger person and let it go. Maybe he thought I was the creep after all. So, displaced Louisianian, let's not meet. I never told this story to anyone other than my close friends, but I felt like this was a good outlet to finally get it off my chest publicly. There's something called the 6 degrees of separation theory, which basically states that everyone in the world is separated by at most 6 steps, and, well, I am separated from Trent Reznor, 9 Inch Nails mastermind, by just 1 step, and it was due to a stalker. Back in 2006, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had just joined a pretty particular punk band, which mixed a very loud sound with cabaret-like visuals. We never did make it big, but our act was appealing enough that it got us the attention of many people. One of them, who was a really strange girl, and was always chain-smoking, she had a weird aura, and was always wearing a jacket on her shoulders, meaning her arms were not in sleeves, and who eventually said she wanted to be our manager. She said she was friends with Slash, from Guns N' Roses, that she had managed a couple of bands where she used to live in New Orleans and whatnot, so we decided to hear her out. Our band was a sort of crazy one, so drugs were passed around pretty freely at our parties. This girl, she told us her name was like Christy or something like that, would provide us with party favors sometimes, and would tell us that she was worth $2 million, that she had 5 cars, and that she worked in this luxury building, and that she had a huge house somewhere in the suburbs. The thing was, she was always picking cigarette butts off of the street and smoking the filters like she was a homeless person or something. Something about her just didn't click particularly with me. She always came to see us in some sort of fancy SUV, so I went along with her stories for the most part. Eventually, Christy fell hard for me, told me she was divorcing her husband and that she wanted us to be together. I was intrigued by her, and so I started testing all her stories. I asked to visit her office, and she'd always make up some excuse as to why I couldn't, until eventually she told me that her office had closed down and that they were looking for new space. I asked her why she was using the same car if she had like 5 of them, and again, excuses and more excuses. I asked to visit her at her huge house, and it's the same thing. She would not come up with reasons as to why I couldn't come over for a visit. Mostly that her husband was still there and whatnot. I started to get sick of all her excuses, and I eventually confronted her, telling her I thought she was a huge liar. She got desperate, started making more excuses, and so I just told her to get lost. She had had a previous fight with some of my bandmates before, so she had already been discarded as our prospective manager. She started calling me every day asking to see me. I would constantly tell her no, until one day she showed up at my house at around 5 a.m., apparently wasted. She had said she had picked up this guy friend of hers to go to a party, but that he was too drunk and he was now passed out in her car and she didn't know what to do with him. I looked across the street and saw no one in her car, and she said it was because the guy was laying down. I didn't really feel like bothering to go into the car to check it out. She eventually started crying, and I felt bad enough for her that I let her come into my living room. It was at this point that she took off her jacket, and for the first time ever, I realized that she was actually missing her whole left arm. I was already giddy by her showing up at her house drunk and all that I didn't dare ask how that happened. I know this has nothing to do with my story, but it was just something that I had already added to the weirded out atmosphere. I hung out with her for a while. At this point I started doubting that she was actually drunk, and I gave her some coffee. I told her please never to show up at my house in this manner again. And eventually I told her to just drop the guy off at Waffle House and then just go home. It might not have been the most responsible thing to tell somebody in that state to drive, but I really just wanted this whole thing to be over. And like I said, I felt like she was just pretending to be drunk the whole time, and that she seemed okay enough to drive. She eventually left, and that was that for the night. Next day, she started stalking me by phone, to the point in which I just stopped picking it up. I worked early hours, and she would call me at like 2 or 3 a.m., completely drunk. I eventually got sick of it all and told her to stay away from me and to never call again. She complied for about a week or so, and it seemed like the whole thing was history. About 6 days later, she calls me again when I was at work. I started telling her that she wasn't supposed to call me, but she said she could finally invite me over to her house and that she wanted me to come visit her. All sorts of red flags were going up for me, so of course I told her to just forget about it and just hung up on her. She again started calling me at late hours, to the point where I just had to turn off my phone at night, otherwise I would never get a good night's sleep. I remember it was a Friday night. After waking up, I had a voicemail on my phone that was left around 2 a.m. I checked it out, and it was her saying, "Hi Max, I just took 200 pills, and I've been drinking all night. I just wanted to say goodbye and that I love you. Good luck with the rest of your life." Needless to say, I got totally weirded out. I was so sick of her lies, I just deleted the message, completely assuming it was just one of her ploys to get me to call her. I decided to forget about it, and I went to work. Next Tuesday after that, I got another voicemail from her phone, but this time it was a guy's voice. "Hey Max, this is Christy's husband. I'm calling her friends on her contact list to let them know that she passed away last Friday, and that we're doing a memorial for her downtown Atlanta tomorrow. If you want to go, please call me back so that I can give you the address." I can't even explain how I felt at this point. I was shocked, and I tried to evade the news by thinking that this was just some guy that Christy had manipulated into calling me just to get me somewhere at some time, but of course, the whole situation still didn't make much sense to me. This guy eventually called another one of my bandmates, whose name was apparently on Christy's contact list as well. I had told my band about the entire situation, so my bandmate, who had been suspicious of this girl for a while, started prying this guy for more info. We eventually learned that she had used a fake name with us the whole time, and that her real name was Amber Applebaum, and that she was using a made-up name because she had been in trouble with the law. We googled her, and sure enough, it turns out she had stalked Trent Razor in the past and even managed to steal his credit card info. She was eventually arrested for it. I was stunned at this point, unsure of what to do next. We never went to the memorial, we were way too suspicious to do that. To To this day, I still don't know if this girl really committed suicide, or if this whole thing was just a sham to get me into some trouble. But since I've never heard from her again, I doubt it. Maybe she's been using a fake name ever since and decided to move on with her life. I'll never know, but it's definitely the worst way to get within 1 degree of separation with somebody famous. I got rid of my cell phone after that, and it took me 3 years until I felt okay to get a new one. I never really wanted to go through something like that ever again.